A dust-covered drifter rides into Silver Creek, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1882, carrying nothing but scarred hands and fragmented memories from a head injury 2 years prior. When a desperate Mexican woman named Isabella approaches him in the saloon, begging him to find her missing husband Miguel, who disappeared during a cattle drive, the cowboy, known only as Jack, accepts the job for the promise of $50. As he begins tracking the cold trail through hostile territory, strange dreams plague his nights. Visions of a wedding ceremony, a woman's laughter, and Spanish words he somehow understands but can't remember learning. Chapter 1. The Woman in the Saloon. The October wind carried the taste of coming winter as the lone rider descended into Silver Creek, Wyoming, his weathered duster coat billowing behind him like the wings of some great, tired bird. The man who called himself Jack had been drifting through the territories for 2 years now, following cattle drives and railroad camps, always moving, never quite remembering why he couldn't stay still. His hands bore the calluses of hard work, and a distinctive scar ran along his right temple, disappearing into his dark hairline, a reminder of whatever violent incident had stolen his memories and left him wandering like a ghost through his own life. Silver Creek sprawled before him in the fading light, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a muddy main street. The town had grown fat on silver mining and cattle money, its saloons and boarding houses catering to men seeking fortune or forgetting failure. Jack guided his paint horse toward the livery stable, his movements automatic, practiced, though he couldn't recall where he'd learned to handle a horse with such natural ease. The stable hand, a gap-toothed old-timer, barely glanced up as Jack paid for 3 nights' boarding, using coins earned from his last job breaking horses outside Cheyenne. The Broken Wheel Saloon beckoned with yellow lamplight and the tinny melody of an out-of-tune piano. Jack pushed through the batwing doors, his spurs announcing his arrival with metallic whispers against the floorboards. The familiar smell of whiskey, tobacco smoke, and unwashed men enveloped him, a scent that somehow felt both foreign and comfortable. He ordered a beer at the bar, keeping his back to the wall out of habit, another instinct from his lost past. She entered the saloon just as Jack was contemplating his 3rd beer, and something about her movement caught his attention immediately. Unlike the painted ladies who worked the room with practiced smiles, this woman moved with desperate purpose, her green eyes scanning each face with an intensity that spoke of long searching. She wore a simple brown dress, travel-worn but carefully mended, and her black hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized the classical beauty of her Mexican heritage. When those green eyes found Jack, they widened slightly, and she approached with quick, determined steps. Isabella Ramirez had been searching for 2 years, spending her savings on hired trackers and false leads, chasing shadows across 3 territories. The cowboy at the bar bore an uncanny resemblance to her missing husband. The same broad shoulders, the same way of holding himself, even the same unconscious habit of drumming his left fingers against his thigh when thinking. But this man's face was weather-beaten where Miguel's had been smooth, scarred where Miguel's had been unmarked, and his eyes held no recognition when they met hers. She spoke in accented English, her voice carrying a musical quality that stirred something deep in Jack's chest, though he couldn't say why the sound made his heart race. Isabella explained her plight with carefully chosen words, describing how her husband Miguel had joined a cattle drive to earn money for their small ranch, how the drive had disappeared somewhere along the Comanche Trail, how she'd sold everything to finance her search. From a small leather pouch, she produced a daguerreotype photograph, its surface damaged by water and time, the face scratched beyond recognition, leaving only the ghost of a tall man's silhouette. Jack studied the ruined photograph, his fingers tracing the scratches unconsciously. The promised payment of $50 would stake him through winter, but something else compelled him to accept Isabella's desperate commission. Perhaps it was the way she pronounced certain Spanish words, rolling them off her tongue in a manner that felt hauntingly familiar, or perhaps it was simply the loneliness that recognized itself in another soul. He agreed to search for Miguel Ramirez, unaware that he was accepting a quest to find himself. Chapter 2. Following Shadows Through Sacred Ground. The trail leading out of Silver Creek wound through broken country, where sandstone cliffs rose like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. Jack rode with the morning sun at his back, following directions wrung from old cowboys and freight drivers who remembered the doomed cattle drive from 2 years past. The Comanche Trail, they called it, though the Comanche had been pushed onto reservations years before. Still, the land remembered violence, and Jack felt it in the unnatural silence that hung over the sage-covered valleys, in a way his paint horse's ears swiveled nervously at every shadow. 3 days into his journey, the terrain began triggering strange sensations in Jack's mind. His hands knew these reins. His body anticipated each twist in the trail before his eyes registered the turns. When he reached a fork where 3 canyons converged, his horse turned left without prompting, following a path Jack couldn't consciously remember choosing. The headache started then, sharp pains behind his right temple where the scar tissue pulled tight. With each familiar landmark, the pain intensified, as if his brain were fighting to break through walls that had been built to contain something terrible. The massacre site revealed itself gradually, like a story written in scattered bones and rusted metal. Jack found it in a box canyon 5 days from Silver Creek. A natural trap with a cattle drive had been ambushed. The desert had claimed most of the evidence, but enough remained to paint a picture of sudden, overwhelming violence. Sun-bleached cattle bones lay scattered among the sage, and here and there, the remnants of a wagon showed where the drovers had made their final stand. Jack dismounted, leading his nervous horse through the killing ground, his boots crunching on ground that seemed to whisper with ghostly memories. Among the debris, something glinted in the afternoon sun. Jack knelt, brushing away 2 years of accumulated sand to reveal a silver belt buckle, its surface engraved with an elaborate design of intertwined roses and thorns. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, pain exploded through his skull like lightning. Images flashed behind his eyelids. A woman's hands fastening this very buckle around his waist, those same hands touching his face with tender familiarity, green eyes filled with love and worry. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left Jack gasping. The buckle clutched so tightly in his fist that the metal edges drew blood from his palm. The old Comanche found Jack that evening, appearing from the shadows like smoke given form. He was ancient, his face a map of deep valleys and high ridges, his eyes milky with cataracts, yet somehow seeing everything. The medicine man spoke in broken English mixed with Spanish and Comanche, a linguistic stew that Jack's ears somehow parsed with unexpected ease. The old man, called Jack, the one who walks between worlds, speaking of a warrior who had died here 2 years ago but refused to leave, a spirit caught between life and death, searching for something he'd forgotten how to name. The medicine man led Jack to a hidden spring where the Comanche had once performed purification rituals. There, carved into the soft sandstone, were dozens of names, drovers who'd passed through over the years, leaving their marks on sacred ground. Jack's fingers found one carving almost without conscious thought. Miguel Ramirez, 1880, para Isabella mi amor. His own hand had made these marks. He knew it with a certainty that bypassed memory and spoke directly to his bones. The recognition sent him stumbling backward, his mind reeling as fragments of identity tried to coalesce. That night, camped beneath stars that seemed too bright and too close, Jack's dreams transformed from vague shadows into vivid scenes. He heard Isabella's voice calling a name that started with M, but dissolved before he could grasp it fully. She spoke Spanish endearments that his sleeping mind translated perfectly, words of love and promise that made his chest ache with loss. He saw her in a white dress beside a small chapel, saw his own hands, younger, unscarred, placing a simple gold ring on her finger. He saw himself promising to return from the cattle drive with enough money to buy the ranch they dreamed of, saw her green eyes bright with tears as she blessed him for the journey. Jack woke with the taste of Spanish words on his tongue and the ghost of Isabella's kiss on his lips. The silver buckle still clutched in his hand, its edges now warm with his own remembered life. Chapter 3. The mission bell's memory. The San Rafael mission materialized from the desert heat like a vision from another century, its adobe walls glowing amber in the late afternoon sun. Jack had ridden hard for 2 days after leaving the massacre site, following a trail of rumor and half-remembered instinct that pulled him toward this remote outpost of faith. The mission stood partially abandoned, its outer buildings crumbling back into the earth from which they'd been formed, but the main chapel remained intact, its bell tower rising defiantly against the endless New Mexico sky. Something about the sight of that tower stirred a deep recognition in Jack's chest, a feeling of homecoming that made no logical sense for a man who claimed no past. The courtyard was empty save for a few scraggly chickens pecking at the dust, but Jack could sense he was being watched. His boots echoed on the worn stones as he approached the chapel, each step feeling like a journey backward through time. The massive wooden doors stood partially open, revealing cool darkness within. Jack removed his hat instinctively, muscle memory guiding the gesture of respect he couldn't remember learning. Inside, candles flickered before painted saints whose eyes seemed to follow his movement, and the air hung thick with centuries of incense and prayer. The bell tower stairs were narrow and winding, worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. Jack climbed without knowing why, drawn upward by a compulsion stronger than curiosity. At the top, the great bronze bell hung silent, its surface green with verdigris. But it wasn't the bell that stopped Jack's breath. It was the carving on the wooden beam beside it. There, cut deep into the aged oak, were the initials M and I, surrounded by a carefully carved heart. Jack's fingers traced the letters, and he knew with absolute certainty that his own hand had made these marks. The knife work was distinctive, the way the M curved into the heart's edge, the small flourish at the base of the I. This was his declaration of love, carved in a moment of joy he could no longer fully remember. The voice that spoke behind him was gentle, but startled Jack nonetheless. Padre Francisco was an elderly man, his brown Franciscan robes worn thin at the elbows, his face weathered by decades of desert sun. But his eyes were sharp with recognition as they studied Jack's face, seeing past the beard and scars to something underneath. The Padre spoke carefully, as if afraid his words might shatter something fragile, calling Jack by a name that felt like a key turning in a long-locked door, Miguel. The story came out slowly, told in the Padre's measured Spanish-accented English as they sat in the mission's small garden. 2 years ago, Apache raiders had brought a dying man to the mission, not out of mercy, but as a warning to others who might traverse their sacred lands. The man had suffered a terrible head wound, the tomahawk blow that created the scar Jack now bore. For weeks, he'd hovered between life and death, tended by the mission brothers who'd seen too much frontier violence to give up on any soul. When he'd finally awakened, his memory was gone, wiped clean as if God himself had erased the slate of his past. The Padre revealed how they'd christened him Jack after the feast day of his awakening, St. John's Day. They'd given him new papers, a new identity, partly to protect him from Apache warriors who might return to finish their work, but also from Mexican authorities who'd been investigating the destroyed cattle drive for evidence of smuggling. The mission had connections with ranchers heading north, and they'd sent Jack away with a horse and supplies, hoping distance might heal what prayer could not. The Padre had prayed daily that somehow Miguel would find his way back to his Isabella, though he'd never imagined it would happen like this. As night fell over the mission, Jack felt the walls in his mind beginning to crumble. Each detail the Padre shared, how Miguel had arrived at the mission months before the attack seeking blessing for his journey, how he'd spoken constantly of Isabella during his recovery before the memory loss became apparent, how he'd unconsciously carved wooden crosses with the same distinctive style as the initials in the bell tower. Each revelation was like a hammer blow against the fortress of his amnesia. By the time Jack mounted his horse to race back towards Silver Creek, his head splitting with the pain of returning memories, he was no longer sure where Jack ended and Miguel began. Chapter 4. Midnight's Recognition. The clock tower of Silver Creek struck midnight as Jack's exhausted horse thundered down the empty main street, its hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. 5 days of hard riding from the San Rafael mission had brought him back to where his quest began, though now he carried fragments of another man's life rattling in his skull like broken glass. The town slept beneath a crescent moon, but Jack knew exactly where to find Isabella. The boarding house on Calvary Street had been mentioned only once in their meeting, yet his feet found the path as surely as if he'd walked it 1,000 times before. Mrs. Morrison's boarding house stood at the end of a row of similar buildings, distinguished only by the small garden of desert flowers someone had coaxed to grow beside the front steps. Jack stood in the street, his breath misting in the cold night air, watching a single candle flicker in an upstairs window. Through the thin curtains, he could see a figure kneeling in prayer, the silhouette's graceful movements achingly familiar. His hand found a silver belt buckle in his pocket, its weight both foreign and familiar, like everything else about the life he was beginning to remember. Isabella's room was sparse but clean, furnished with the few possessions she'd managed to keep while funding her endless search. Jack stood in the doorway, having climbed the stairs with a silence born of instinct rather than intention. She knelt before a small altar she'd created on the dresser, her mother's rosary beads moving through her fingers with practiced rhythm. The Spanish words of her prayer washed over Jack like water over a dam, each phrase eroding more of the barrier between his two selves. She prayed for Miguel's return, for God to guide him home, for the strength to continue searching even as hope grew thin as winter ice. When she spoke of Miguel, her voice carried the weight of 2 years' worth of gathered memories, polished smooth by constant handling. She told the saints about his habits, speaking to them as if they were old friends who might have seen him passing by. How he carved little wooden animals when his hands needed occupation, his knife moving with unconscious precision to free the shapes hidden in the wood. Jack's left hand moved to his belt where his knife rested, his fingers already feeling the phantom texture of soft pine, the way the grain would split if cut against it. Isabella spoke of how Miguel hummed, when he worked, always the same melody, a half-remembered lullaby his grandmother had sung in Sonora. Without conscious thought, Jack found himself humming that very tune, the notes rising from somewhere deeper than memory. Isabella's prayers stopped mid-word, her body becoming perfectly still in that way prey animals freeze when sensing danger. She turned slowly, her green eyes wide in the candlelight, taking in the tall figure in her doorway. Jack stepped forward into the light, and Isabella's sharp intake of breath was like a knife between his ribs. Her gaze traced his features with desperate intensity, searching past the beard, past the weather-worn skin, past the scar that bisected his temple where Miguel's birthmark had once been. She rose with deliberate slowness, approaching him as one might approach a spooked horse or a dream that might dissolve if startled. Her fingers reached toward his face, stopping just short of contact, trembling in the space between them. Isabella spoke his name, not Jack, but Miguel, and the sound of it in her voice shattered the last walls in his mind. The memories came flooding back in a torrential rush. Their wedding day in the small chapel outside Magdalena, their first winter in the tiny ranch house with its leaking roof, the morning he'd left for the cattle drive, promising to return before the first snow. Isabella revealed that she'd suspected from the moment she'd seen him in the saloon, recognizing something essential in his movements, in the way he held his shoulders, in the unconscious drumming of his left fingers that had always betrayed his thoughts. But she needed him to remember on his own, needed the recognition to come from within rather than being forced upon him like an ill-fitting coat. She'd sent him on this quest, not to find her husband, but to find himself, knowing that the trail would lead him back to who he truly was. As the clock struck 1, marking a new day's beginning, Miguel Ramirez held his wife for the first time in 2 years, both of them weeping for all that had been lost and miraculously found, their tears washing away the dust of forgotten roads and the false identity that had kept them apart. Miguel and Isabella Ramirez rebuilt their life together in Silver Creek, where the townspeople came to know them for their devotion and the mysterious story of a love so strong that even a lost memory couldn't keep them apart. The silver belt buckle that triggered Miguel's memories now hung above their fireplace, a reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys lead us not to new frontiers, but back to the hearts that never stopped waiting for us. Their ranch prospered, their love deepened with each passing season, and Miguel never again forgot the name Isabella whispered to him each morning, the name that brought him home.